The room fell silent. Not the kind of quiet that happens when a speaker pauses for effect, but the deep, vacuum-like hush that descends when something utterly unexpected has occurred, when the script has been flipped so completely that everyone present needs a moment to process what they just witnessed. Pam Bondi stood frozen at the podium, her lips slightly parted, clearly caught mid-thought as the reality of the last 60 seconds washed over her. It had started as just another political showdown, the kind that had become so routine in Washington that few people even bothered to tune in anymore. Attorney General Pam Bondi, standing before a bank of microphones at the Department of Justice, had called the press conference to announce what her allies were calling the most significant corruption investigation in American history, and what her detractors were already branding a political witch hunt. The target, she declared, was none other than former President Barack Obama and a circle of his top intelligence officials. The charge, manufacturing intelligence about Russian interference in the 2016 election to undermine the Trump presidency before it even began. Bondi's voice had that particular edge reserved for moments of maximum political theater. She spoke of treasonous conspiracies and a deep state coup, her words carefully chosen to echo the rhetoric that had been building for weeks following explosive document declassifications by Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. The grand jury had been convened in Florida, she announced, a strategic choice that ensured the proceedings would unfold far from what conservatives considered the hostile territory of Washington, D.C. Subpoenas were being prepared. The machinery of justice was turning. "We will not allow the highest officials in the land to weaponize their power against the American people and escape accountability," Bondi had declared, her voice rising to meet the moment. "This is a 10-year stain on the country, and we are finally going to clean it up." The reporters had scribbled furiously. The cameras had rolled. And then, just as Bondi opened the floor for questions, a commotion at the back of the room signaled that something had changed. Barack Obama walked in. He moved with the same easy grace that had characterized his 8 years in the White House, but there was something different about his expression today, a calm so profound it bordered on unsettling. He wasn't accompanied by aides or security detail, just walked alone through the crowd of stunned journalists who parted before him like water before a ship's prow. Bondi watched him approach, and for the first time that afternoon, she seemed to lose her own narrative. The former president reached the podium and stood beside her, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knows exactly where the floor is and isn't afraid to stand on it. He waited for Bondi to acknowledge him, and when she didn't, when she simply stood there with that frozen expression, he turned to the microphones himself. "I understand there are serious matters being discussed here today, and I appreciate that the American people deserve answers about what happened in 2016. I've always believed that." He paused, letting the words settle over the room. "So I thought I'd save everyone some time and come down here myself." The room erupted. Reporters shouted over each other. Camera flashes exploded in staccato bursts. But Obama raised one hand, and the chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. "Pam here has raised some very serious allegations. She's suggested that I personally directed intelligence officials to manufacture a false narrative about Russian interference. She's suggested that this constituted treason, and she's convened a grand jury in Florida to investigate these claims." He let the words hang in the air. "So here I am. Ask me anything." The challenge was so unexpected, so utterly outside the bounds of normal political procedure, that Bondi physically stepped back from the podium, as if the proximity to Obama had suddenly become dangerous. Her staffers huddled behind her, whispering urgently, but she seemed not to hear them. Her eyes were fixed on the former president with an expression that news cameras would later describe as shell-shocked. Obama waited.
The silence stretched.
"Ma'am, you have the floor," Obama said, gently, gesturing toward Bondi. "You've made serious accusations. You've called for a grand jury. You've suggested I belong in prison. So I'm giving you the opportunity to ask your questions directly. No lawyers, no filters, just you and me, right here, right now." Bondi's mouth opened, then closed. She looked down at her notes, then back at Obama, then toward her staff, who appeared equally paralyzed. A full 30 seconds passed, an eternity in live television, during which the only sound was the whir of cameras and the nervous shuffling of feet. When Bondi finally spoke, her voice had lost all its earlier fire. "This isn't the appropriate venue for this discussion," she managed. "There are legal procedures, a grand jury process." Obama nodded thoughtfully, as if considering a reasonable point. "I understand procedure. I taught constitutional law. But I also understand that when you accuse someone of treason, when you suggest they should face the death penalty for betraying their country, you ought to be able to look them in the eye and explain why. So I'm here. Explain it to me. What specifically did I do that constitutes treason against the United States?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. Bondi had spent weeks making broad accusations, using inflammatory language, and feeding a narrative to friendly media outlets, but she had never been required to specify, to look at the actual human being she was accusing and articulate exactly what crime she believed he had committed. "Well, there's the intelligence assessment," Bondi began, but her voice trailed off. "The intelligence assessment," Obama repeated. "You mean the one that 17 intelligence agencies agreed on? The one that the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee confirmed? The one that even your own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has publicly stated was accurate?" Bondi's jaw tightened. "There were documents declassified that show—" "That show what?" Obama interrupted, but gently, not aggressively. "That Russia tried to interfere in our election? We all know that. That's not in dispute. Or are you suggesting something else? That I personally hacked into DNC servers? That I directed Putin to release Hillary Clinton's emails? Because those would be actual crimes. Those would actually be treason." The logic was unassailable, and everyone in the room knew it. The accusations against Obama had always existed in the realm of implication and innuendo, never in the realm of specific, provable criminal acts. When forced into the light, they evaporated. Bondi tried to regroup. "The issue is whether you directed intelligence officials to fabricate. Directed them how? At what meeting? On what date? In what document? You have access to all my records. You have access to every email, every phone call, every intelligence briefing from my entire presidency. So show me, show the American people the evidence you claim to have." This was the moment that would later be replayed countless times on news networks and social media platforms. Bondi, the aggressive prosecutor who had built a career on confident accusations, stood completely silent. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her staff had stopped whispering and simply watched, their faces pale. "I asked a question, Madam Attorney General," Obama pressed, still calm, still measured, still utterly in control. "You've had months to prepare for this. You've had intelligence briefings. You've had a grand jury convened. So you must have something. What is it?" The silence that followed was the kind that becomes legendary in Washington, the kind that marks the exact moment when political momentum shifts irreversibly. Bondi opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Finally, barely audibly, she managed, "This press conference is concluded." But as she turned to leave, Obama's voice stopped her. "Pam." She turned back, and for the first time, Obama's expression showed something other than calm inquiry. There was sadness there, deep, genuine sadness.
"You have an important job," he said quietly. "You're the Attorney General of the United States. That means you're not supposed to be a political operative. You're not supposed to be a cable news commentator. You're supposed to be the person who ensures that justice is applied equally, without fear or favor." He paused. "I hope, for the country's sake, that you remember that." Bondi stood frozen for another long moment, then walked out of the room without another word. Her staff scrambled after her, leaving Obama alone at the podium, surrounded by reporters who had suddenly forgotten how to ask questions. The former president waited until the door closed behind Bondi, then turned to the press corps with a slight smile. "Any other questions? I'm happy to stay." What followed was perhaps the most remarkable press conference in modern political history. For the next hour, Obama answered every question thrown at him about Russia, about the intelligence community, about his relationship with Trump, about the very accusations that had prompted the grand jury investigation. He didn't dodge, he didn't deflect, he simply answered, with the kind of directness that had characterized his best moments in office. No, he hadn't manufactured intelligence. Yes, he stood by the assessment that Russia had interfered. No, he didn't believe Trump had colluded with Russia in the legal sense, though he found the campaign's willingness to benefit from Russian help troubling. Yes, he understood why Trump supporters might distrust the intelligence community after years of contradictory narratives. No, he didn't think Bondi was evil. He thought she was doing what she felt she had to do in a political environment that rewarded aggression over accuracy. By the time he finished, the entire narrative had shifted. The grand jury investigation, which had seemed so ominous just hours earlier, now appeared as what critics had always claimed it was: a political exercise designed to satisfy a base rather than to uncover actual wrongdoing. Bondi's silence had spoken louder than any evidence she might have produced. The aftermath was swift and brutal for the administration. Editorial pages that had cautiously supported the investigation now mocked it. Republican senators who had been quietly uncomfortable with the probe suddenly found their voices, suggesting that perhaps a special counsel should review the matter to ensure its legitimacy. Even some conservative commentators admitted that Bondi's performance had been a disaster, that if you're going to accuse a former president of treason, you should at least be able to articulate the accusation when he's standing right in front of you. In the days that followed, the grand jury quietly faded from headlines. No subpoenas were issued, no witnesses were called. The investigation, as such it was, simply stopped. When pressed by reporters, DOJ spokespersons would only say that the matter was under review, a phrase universally understood to mean that nothing was happening and nothing would happen. Bondi herself retreated from public view for nearly 2 weeks. When she finally reappeared at a routine departmental event, she looked different, subdued, careful, almost tentative. The fire that had characterized her earlier public statements was gone, replaced by a cautious precision that suggested she had learned something about the difference between political theater and actual governance. The moment that had left her speechless had done more than embarrass her personally. It had exposed the fundamental weakness of investigations built on narrative rather than evidence. It had reminded Washington that actual human beings stand behind political accusations, and it had demonstrated in the most public way possible that calm reason can sometimes be the most powerful weapon of all. For Obama, the moment was simply what it was, an opportunity to defend his legacy and his integrity directly, without the filters of lawyers or spokespeople. He returned to his post-presidential life, to his foundation work and his memoir writing, occasionally appearing at events, but mostly staying out of the daily political fray. But everyone who had witnessed that moment in the DOJ press room knew they had seen something rare. A politician who, when challenged, showed up to answer. And Bondi? She would go on with her work, implementing policy and defending administration positions, but she never again spoke publicly about investigating Barack Obama. Some lessons, it seemed, only needed to be learned once. The room had fallen silent that day, but what emerged from that silence was something Washington rarely sees: accountability, real and immediate, delivered not through legal briefs or investigative reports, but through the simple act of one person showing up and asking, "What exactly do you accuse me of?" It turned out that when you strip away the rhetoric and the spin and the political calculation, that question is surprisingly difficult to answer, especially when the person asking it is standing right in front of you, waiting for a response that never comes.